In this video lesson, we'll discuss ways that abolitionists protested and resisted the newly passed Fugitive Slave Act, and we'll look at the violence in Kansas and Nebraska over the issue of slavery. One of the first victims of the Fugitive Slave Act was a runaway slave named Anthony Burns. He was captured in Boston and sent back to the South in shackles. As a result of his trial, anti-slavery sentiment in the North soared. Burns and other runaways were captured, had a hearing, and then were returned at government expense to slavery. Slaves could not defend themselves or have their case heard by a jury. Also, judges who heard these cases were paid $10 to find a man a slave, but only $5 if he determined that the man was free. Although faced with some fines and jail, some Northerners helped the runaways to escape to Canada. Escaping into the northern United States was no longer safe because of the Fugitive Slave Act. States also passed something called personal liberty laws, which forbade the imprisonment of the runaway slaves and guaranteed runaways a trial by jury to be able to slow down their return to slavery. In this picture, this is a picture from the time period that depicts the effects of the Fugitive Slave Law. Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Free African Americans and white abolitionists developed a secret network of people called the Underground Railroad, who would aid fugitive slaves in their escape. One of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who is seen here in this picture. Using terms from the new railroad so that people would not get suspicious, some conductors, like Harriet Tubman, entered the South repeatedly to sneak slaves to safety. These conductors, as they were called, hid fugitives in secret tunnels, gave them food and clothing, and directed them safely to the next station. Harriet Tubman, who was a runaway slave, escaped to Philadelphia in 1849 and made 19 trips to the South, helping over 300 slaves escape to freedom, including her own parents, and she was never captured. After the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, runaway slaves were not safe from slave catchers in the North. They had to journey all the way to Canada to be safe and to be guaranteed their freedom. Avenues or routes of slaves moving from the South through the North to Canada can be seen here on this map of the Underground Railroad. Most slaves who made it to the North were from the Upper South. This area here, closer to the dividing line. Slaves who were caught escaping were sold to the Deep South, where escape was nearly impossible. And the Deep South would be more along the lines of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, as far south as they could, so that it was not possible or very unlikely that they could escape north again and make it all of that way to Canada. The daughter of an avid abolitionist, Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, witnessed numerous escapes from slavery, and she wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a historical fictional novel that highlighted the struggle for freedom. It had a melodramatic plot, and the characters were very stereotyped, but it portrayed slavery as a moral struggle. In her book, the evil overseer, Simon Legree, was going to sell a slave named Eliza's son, so she escaped across the frozen Ohio River. Also portrayed in the book, the evil overseer, Legree, whipped Tom so badly that he died. This book caused quite a stir in the North and roused the abolitionists. And Lincoln actually remarked when he later met Harriet Beecher Stowe, pictured here in this picture, that so this is the little lady who started this great war. Her book definitely intensified the abolitionist fight. Tension in Kansas and Nebraska is going to increase over the issue of slavery in the territories. in 1854. A man named Senator Stephen Douglas, who is pictured here in this picture, and his wealthy backers wanted a planned railroad to run through their city of Chicago. And in order to make this happen, he needed to populate the northern tier of states, since the South was settled west to Texas. So to encourage farmers to settle there, he developed a proposal to divide the existing territory into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. In these two territories, he pushed the idea of popular sovereignty, which we already know is allowing the settlers to decide if they want slavery before being admitted into the Union. So they would vote to decide whether the state would be free or slave. He wanted to appeal to the North and the South because he was planning to run for president. It was unlikely that either state would want slaves, since plantation crops did not grow there. But this, allowing popular sovereignty in these two areas, would in fact nullify the Missouri Compromise, because both of these two areas were above the 3630 parallel. Douglas introduced the act in Congress in January 1854 to establish popular sovereignty in the two territories and promote settlement. The North saw it as a way to expand slavery, and the South voted against it. But the bill actually passed with President Franklin Pierce's help and became law in May of 1854. Settlers, who were mostly non-slaveholders, moved to Kansas, and in 1855 they held an election to determine if the majority were in favor of slavery or not. You can see Kansas and Nebraska territory highlighted here on the map, clearly above the 3630 parallel. Even in this larger map, you can see more clearly. You can see that the pink areas of Nebraska and Kansas are here, open to popular sovereignty, as were Utah and New Mexico by the Compromise of 1850. Then the free states are in purple and the slave states are in green. Violence is going to erupt in what becomes called Bleeding Kansas. Elections are held in March of 1855. Thousands of what's called border ruffians from the slave state of Missouri cross into Kansas and vote illegally in the election. So they win a fraudulent majority for the pro-slavery candidates, who set up a government at Lecompton, which is a town there, and began issuing pro-slavery acts. So it ends up that Kansas becomes a slave state. The Lecompton Constitution makes Kansas a slave state, even though most of the actual residents did not actually want slaves. It was the border ruffians that basically swayed the vote and voted illegally. Abolitionists organized a rival government in Topeka in 1885. Anti-slavery settlers then found a town called Lawrence in Kansas. A pro-slavery jury condemned Lawrence's inhabitants as traitors and called for their arrest. Then about 800 pro-slavery people swept into Lawrence to arrest the people of Lawrence, burned the anti-slavery headquarters, and looted many houses and stores. As a result, a man named John Brown hears about what's happening in Kansas, and he believed that God had called on him to fight slavery. John Brown is pictured here in this picture. So looking for revenge for the events in Lawrence, Brown and his followers savagely killed 5 men from the pro-slavery settlement of Pottawatomie Creek. Brown actually was misinformed and had thought that the pro-slavery settlers who had sacked the town of Lawrence had killed 5 men. And so killing these 5 men, he felt, was revenge for that act. The massacre triggered dozens of other incidents of violence in Kansas, and people began to call the territory Bleeding Kansas because of the violence and bloodshed over the issue of slavery. Violence did not stop in Kansas. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gave his Crimes Against Kansas speech, where he made derogatory and insulting remarks against a South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler. Butler's nephew, who was a congressman named Preston Brooks, entered the chamber and beat Sumner so badly with a cane that he was unable to return to D.C. for 3 years. And you can see this event pictured in a drawing here in the slide. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1851, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act divided the country rather than ease its tensions. And we'll discuss more the impact and the forward tensions that are going to eventually cause the Civil War in class.